Somewhere beneath the surface of the Aegean Sea, there is a city. Not a myth. Not a legend invented by poets to entertain kings. A real city. With real streets, real temples, real people who lived and loved and died within its walls. A city that was, in its time, one of the most powerful and prosperous in the entire Greek world. And then, in a single catastrophic moment that ancient sources describe with a terror that still resonates 2,000 years later, it was gone. Swallowed. Erased. Buried beneath water and silence and the slow, indifferent passage of centuries. Historians know it existed. Archaeologists have found its traces. Ancient writers described it with the kind of reverent, horrified awe that people reserve for things that should not have been possible. And yet, almost no one talks about it, not in classrooms, not in documentaries, not in the endless parade of books about ancient Greece that fill library shelves around the world. Because some stories are too uncomfortable to tell. Some ruins ask questions that the official version of history would prefer to leave unanswered. Tonight, we go beneath the surface. In every sense of the word. When we think of ancient Greece, we think of Athens, of Sparta, of the great city-states whose names have echoed through history for 2,500 years. But the ancient Greek world was not just those famous cities. At its height, Greek civilization stretched from the Black Sea in the east to the coast of Spain in the west. From the rocky shores of Asia Minor to the sun-baked plains of North Africa, hundreds of city-states, thousands of settlements, a vast, interconnected web of trade, culture, and conflict that made the Mediterranean world hum with energy for centuries. Most of those cities are forgotten, not because they were unimportant, not because nothing significant happened within their walls, but because history, like all human institutions, has its favorites, its chosen stories, its canonical heroes, and its convenient silences. The city we are going to talk about tonight was not one of history's favorites. It was something rarer and more unsettling, a city that history actively tried to forget. Its name was Helike, and in the winter of 373 BC, on a night that ancient writers described as clear and cold and utterly without warning, it ceased to exist. Not through conquest, not through plague, not through the slow economic decline that ended most ancient cities. In a single night, Helike, a city of tens of thousands of people, a major religious center, a wealthy trading hub that had stood for centuries, was swallowed by the earth and drowned beneath the waters of the Corinthian Gulf. Every single person in the city died. And the ancient world watched in absolute, paralyzed horror. To understand what was lost on that winter night in 373 BC, we must first understand what Helike was. Helike sat on the southern shore of the Corinthian Gulf, in the region of Achaea in the northern Peloponnese. It was not a small, provincial settlement clinging to the edges of the Greek world. It was a major city, the leader of the Achaean League, a confederation of 12 cities that gave it political influence far beyond its own borders, a center of trade whose merchants sailed routes across the entire Mediterranean, a city wealthy enough to mint its own coins, maintain its own fleet, and send delegations to the great pan-Hellenic sanctuaries at Delphi and Olympia. But what made Helike truly significant, what gave it a prestige that even Athens and Sparta acknowledged, was its temple. The sanctuary of Poseidon at Helike was one of the most important religious sites in the entire Greek world. Poseidon, god of the sea, god of earthquakes, the deity the Greeks called the Earth Shaker, was worshipped at Helike with a devotion and a ritual sophistication that drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. The temple complex was vast. The statue of Poseidon within it was described by ancient writers as one of the great works of Greek religious art, a towering bronze figure whose eyes, some sources claimed, seemed to follow you as you moved through the sanctuary. This was not a minor local cult. This was one of the premier religious institutions of the ancient Greek world. And Poseidon, as the Greeks were about to be reminded in the most devastating possible way, was not a god who forgave easily. Because in the years before the disaster, something had happened at Hellike that the ancient world considered an act of profound, unforgivable sacrilege. Something that, in the logic of the ancient world, explained everything that followed, and something that modern historians find deeply, uncomfortably interesting for entirely different reasons. The story begins several years before the destruction of Hellike, with a diplomatic incident that ancient sources treat as the triggering event for everything that followed. The Greek colonies of southern Italy, the cities of Magna Graecia, as the Romans would later call them, had long maintained a special relationship with Hellike. As descendants of Achaean settlers who had left the Greek mainland generations earlier, they considered Hellike their mother city, their spiritual home. They wanted something tangible to connect them to that home, something sacred. They sent an embassy to Hellike with a request: give us a statue from the sanctuary of Poseidon, or at least allow us to make a copy of the great bronze image, to take back to our temples in Italy. It was, in the diplomatic language of the ancient world, a reasonable request, a gesture of religious solidarity between a mother city and its colonial descendants. Hellike refused. Not politely, not with diplomatic regret, but with a contempt that ancient sources describe as not merely insulting but actively impious, as if the people of Hellike had forgotten that the sanctuary they guarded was not theirs to withhold. The Italian Greeks appealed to the broader Achaean League. The League sided with Hellike. The ambassadors were sent home empty-handed. In the ancient world, refusing a legitimate religious request was dangerous enough. But what happened next crossed a line that even hardened ancient politicians recognized as catastrophically unwise. According to several ancient sources, the people of Hellike did not merely refuse the Italian Greeks, they killed their ambassadors in the sanctuary of Poseidon itself. The murder of ambassadors was, in ancient Greek law and religious custom, one of the gravest possible offenses. Ambassadors traveled under divine protection. To kill them was to invite the wrath not just of their city, but of the gods themselves. To kill them inside a sacred sanctuary compounded the sacrilege almost beyond comprehension. The ancient world waited for divine retribution. They did not wait long. The winter of 373 BC arrived cold and clear on the shores of the Corinthian Gulf. There had been warnings, ancient sources tell us, not divine warnings, or not only divine warnings, but natural ones, of the kind that people in earthquake-prone regions had learned to recognize over generations. In the days before the disaster, the animals of Hellike began to behave strangely. Mice, and snakes and weasels and centipedes, the small creatures that lived in the walls and foundations of the city's buildings, began emerging in enormous numbers and moving toward the coast. Ancient writers noted this with the matter-of-fact tone of people who understood that animals sometimes sensed what humans could not. The people of Hellike watched this exodus of creatures and did not leave. Perhaps they thought the animals were reacting to something mundane. Perhaps the religious and political crisis of recent years had made the city's leadership unwilling to appear frightened by omens. Perhaps, in the way of people everywhere and in every era, they simply could not believe that the worst was actually coming. It came. On a winter night. Ancient sources disagree on the exact date, but place it sometime in January or February of 373 BC. The earth beneath Hellike moved. Not the gentle trembling that residents of the Corinthian Gulf experienced regularly and had learned to ignore. Something different. Something that ancient writers, searching for adequate language, described as the ground opening, as the city folding into itself, as buildings that had stood for centuries collapsing in seconds, as if they had never existed. The earthquake was catastrophic, but it was not, ultimately, what killed Hellike. What killed Helike was what came after. The sea. In the chaotic minutes following the earthquake, as survivors stumbled through rubble in the darkness, as fires broke out from overturned torches and cooking fires, as people screamed for family members buried beneath collapsed walls, the waters of the Corinthian Gulf receded. This is the phenomenon we now call a tsunami warning sign, the sea pulling back before the wave. Ancient people recognized it too, though they had no scientific framework to explain it. They had only terror. The wave that returned was, by ancient accounts, enormous. It did not merely flood the lower sections of the city. It covered Helike entirely. Buildings, temples, streets, the great sanctuary of Poseidon, with its towering bronze god, everything. By morning, where Helike had stood, there was only water. A lagoon. Calm and flat, and utterly, devastatingly empty. 10,000 people, some ancient sources say more, had died in a single night. Not one survived. For centuries after the disaster, Helike remained visible. Ancient travelers reported being able to see the ruins of the city beneath the shallow waters of the lagoon that had formed over its remains. The bronze statue of Poseidon, they said, was still standing, visible through the water on clear days, its outstretched hand reaching upward as if still waiting for the prayers that would never come again. The Roman writer Pausanias, traveling through the region in the 2nd century AD, 400 years after the disaster, wrote that he could still see the ruins when he looked into the water. Then, gradually, even those traces disappeared. Silt and sediment covered the ruins. The lagoon slowly filled in. The coastline shifted. The earthquake-prone region continued to shake and reshape itself over the centuries, burying Helike deeper and deeper beneath layers of geological time. By the modern era, the exact location of Helike had been completely lost. Scholars knew it had existed. The ancient sources were too numerous and too consistent to dismiss. But where, precisely, it lay beneath the modern landscape of the northern Peloponnese was a mystery. The search for Helike became one of the great obsessions of classical archaeology. For decades, researchers combed the coastline of the Corinthian Gulf. They analyzed ancient texts for geographical clues. They drilled core samples from the soil of the coastal plain. They sent divers into the Gulf to search for traces of ancient structures on the seabed. They found nothing. Then, in 1988, a Greek archaeologist named Dora Katsanopoulou and an American geologist named Stephen Soter began a systematic survey of the coastal plain using a combination of geological analysis, ancient source research, and modern remote sensing technology. It took them 12 years. But in 2001, in a field several kilometers inland from the modern coastline, the coastline having shifted dramatically over 2,000 years, they found it. Pottery fragments. Building foundations. The unmistakable traces of a major ancient settlement buried beneath 4 to 5 meters of soil and sediment. Helike had been found, and what the ongoing excavations have revealed since then has raised questions that go far beyond the story of one lost city. The excavation of Helike is still ongoing. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of continuous human settlement at the site going back to the Bronze Age, more than 1,000 years before the disaster of 373 BC. This was not a young city that had not yet found its footing. It was an ancient, deeply rooted civilization that had survived invasions, wars, famines, and the ordinary catastrophes of ancient life for over a millennium. And it was gone in a single night. The artifacts recovered from the site are heartbreaking in their ordinariness. Cooking pots, children's toys, personal jewelry, the kind of objects that people accumulate over lifetimes and expect to pass on to their children. Objects that were simply left where they fell when the earth moved. The geological analysis of the site has confirmed what ancient sources described. The earthquake, the subsidence of the land, the tsunami, All of it is written in the layers of sediment that buried the city. Science and ancient testimony, for once, tell exactly the same story. But there is something else that the excavations have revealed. Something that the archaeologists did not expect to find. Evidence that Helike did not entirely die in 373 BC. In the layers above the destruction horizon, the distinct geological layer that marks the night of the disaster, there are traces of continued human activity. People returned to the site. They built over the ruins. They lived for a time in the shadow of the catastrophe. Who were these people? Survivors who had been outside the city when the disaster struck. Settlers from neighboring towns who moved into the depopulated land. We do not know. What we know is that the attempt to rebuild did not last. The site was eventually abandoned entirely. Perhaps the psychological weight of living above a mass grave was too great. Perhaps further seismic activity made the land too unstable. Perhaps the economic networks that had made Helike prosperous could not be reconstructed without the city's population and institutions. Whatever the reason, Helike was eventually left to the earth, and the earth kept it, silent and patient, for 2,300 years. Until we started asking questions it had been waiting to answer. Helike is not Atlantis. It requires no mythology, no mystery, no ancient conspiracy to make it significant. It is significant because it is real, because it happened, because tens of thousands of people went to sleep one winter night in a prosperous, ancient, deeply rooted city, and none of them woke up. The ancient Greeks interpreted the destruction of Helike as divine punishment. The wrath of Poseidon visiting itself upon a city that had committed sacrilege against his sanctuary. We interpret it differently. We have seismology and geology, and the patient work of archaeologists to tell us what actually happened beneath the ground that night. But both interpretations share something important. They share the recognition that civilization is fragile, that everything we build, our cities, our institutions, our certainties about tomorrow, rests on ground that can move without warning. Helike stood for over 1,000 years. It fell in a single night. The question that its ruins whisper across 2 millennia is not about earthquakes or tsunamis or ancient religious politics. It is a simpler, more personal question. What would you leave behind if tonight was the last night? This has been Whispers of Athens. Subscribe, leave a comment, tell us what ancient secret you want us to uncover next. Because the earth has many more stories buried within it. And we are only just beginning to dig.